We're very happy to be here amidst our busy schedules, as you heard, but it's very exciting work that we do. And, especially in something like covering the pontificate of Pope Francis or attending a synod of bishops is a great privilege for us to be a part of that world. And so we feel a great responsibility to share what happens in those events with as many people as possible. The first thing I would say, maybe just before we get started, is we have to stop for a minute to appreciate that this is an absolutely historic moment in the life of the Catholic Church. The stuff that we're seeing right now over the last 2 years with Pope Francis and the repercussions of his ministry is really amazing. It's extremely substantial, and it's charting a course for the future of the Church that's going to be felt long into the future. So it's very important to recognize that with all the different things that are going on. So we're going to basically talk about the new evangelization today, specifically from the perspective of Pope Francis. We're going to try our best and say, what lens can we look at the new evangelization through, considering what Pope Francis is doing and what we believe Pope Francis is all about. I want to begin just by reading a quote from the Pope's apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, which is kind of the anchor of our presentation tonight, which is really about evangelization, Pope Francis style, go out and make a mess. That's kind of what we came up with when we were thinking about what Pope Francis wants to do, especially for young people, young adults in the Church today. And this quote is from number 49 in the Pope's apostolic exhortation. He says, "I want to repeat here to the entire Church what I've often said to the priests and the laity in the Diocese of Buenos Aires. I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. More than by fear of going astray, my hope is that we will be moved by the fear of remaining shut up within structures which give us a false sense of security, within rules which make us harsh judges, within habits which make us feel safe, while at our door people are starving, and Jesus does not tire of saying to us, 'Give them something to eat.'" I think that in a nutshell is what Pope Francis wants our attitude to be as a church, and I think it's the starting point for talking about evangelization and new evangelization in the church today. As Cheridan mentioned, it was at this World Youth Day that the Pope first, as Pope, sort of alluded to this kind of church that I mentioned before in that quote that he wants, that is his vision for the church. And we're going to mention that quote later. He was actually meeting with a group of Argentinian youth at the Basilica in Rio. But we wanted to start with the concept of messiness. What does it mean to go out and make a mess, or to be a church, as I read in that quote, that's not afraid to be bruised and dirty and to go out on the street and to accompany people instead of staying locked up, in our churches or in our schools or in our workplaces or whatever.
I think that it's almost a strange concept because whenever we put on the news at night, we immediately see that the world is already a mess. Right? We see just the amount of ecological devastation that's happening. We see the amount of poverty in the world, the fact that so many people are being, trafficked. There's these wars happening all the time, and then when you combine that with your own personal messes, the fact that many people are struggling with broken families, illness, just physical and mental illness, and so when you combine all of those things together, we can almost feel hopeless. We can feel as if there's just too much in the world that is messy and wrong, and how could I ever possibly make a difference? to the situation. I mean, it's really too much to even to conceive of, really.
And the other reality, if we look really honestly at each of our lives, is that individually we're messy. You know, I mean, whether or not we have something kind of external that happens to us, when we look deep down, we see that there are inconsistencies, that there are things that are not quite right, that are things that go wrong. And so the messiness is not only sort of out there in the world, but also in our very lives. And the point is that there is a response to this messiness. And the church offers a response to that messiness. And that it has to start, when we're talking about the new evangelization, with getting back to the roots, which is specifically the person of Jesus and the message of the Gospels. And when Cheridan and I were talking about this, we were thinking, yeah, we kind of hear that, all the time. What can we say that's sort of unique? And we felt that if you want to sort of understand the Gospels today, the lens through which you need to look through them is really the Second Vatican Council of the 1960s. And what that did when all those bishops came together from around the world, the largest gathering of Catholic bishops ever in history, what that did, not only for the church and for the world, it was really a response from the church to the messiness. And it didn't do what a lot of people thought it might do. Instead of sort of putting ourselves up against the world, the bishops really came together and said, no, we have to dialogue, we have to encounter, we have to engage, we have to be open. And that kind of became a change in mentality that has now characterized the church over the last 50 years, and especially characterizes the church in this pontificate of Pope Francis so far. So we see also a continuation of the council and the pontificate of Pope Francis. But that modern approach to looking at the relationship of what it means to be church in the world today has to be the starting point.
For sure. And I think that the big thing that we take away from the Second Vatican Council is that the world needs mercy. The world needs to know the love of Christ. And how do we communicate that today? Well, that is through presence, through encounter, through friendship, through listening. And really, when you think about it, Pope Francis is really the first pope that comes out of the Second Vatican Council. Both Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict, they were there at the council. But Francis is a pope that comes out of that council. So in many ways, he is the embodiment of what we're calling for. And when Pope Benedict called for the new evangelization, well, actually it was Pope John Paul II, but when Pope Benedict called and made the new evangelization a priority for the church, he called for a synod. And that synod essentially was this think tank moment when I was thinking, like, what is it that we need to do to proclaim Christ today? How is it that we're going to repropose Christ? Well, in many ways, Pope Francis is the natural extension of that synod, providentially, just through the fact that Pope Benedict retired, and then Pope Francis comes out of all of that thinking that was happening at that time.
And we can talk more about that if people are interested, but there really is a connection between that synod on the new evangelization and the pontificate of Pope Francis, even though Cardinal Bergoglio was not actually at that synod. Okay, so what does it mean to become a new evangelizer, and what does Pope Francis really want us to do? Now I want to read the quote from the Mass that he celebrated with the Argentinian youth in Rio. It was July 25th, 2013. He said, "Let me tell you what I hope will be the outcome of this World Youth Day. I hope there will be noise. I want you to make yourselves heard in your diocese. I want the noise to go out. I want the church to go out onto the streets. I want us to resist everything worldly, everything static, everything comfortable, everything to do with clericalism, everything that might make us closed in on ourselves. The parishes, the schools, the institutions are made for going out. If they don't, they become an NGO, and the church cannot be an NGO. May the bishops and priests forgive me if some of you create a bit of confusion right now. That's my advice. Thank you for what you do. So this, you can see, it's very consistent with the message that came out that I read at the beginning a few months later in November of 2013 in his exhortation. Extremely consistent. He wants a church that goes out of itself. He wants us not to remain in our comfort zones, but to actually engage, dialogue, propose, encounter. And so we wanted to look at a few qualities of Pope Francis that might help us to be, as kind of a model for us if we're going to be good evangelizers. And the first thing that I would say is we have to recognize what we said at the beginning, the messiness that's out in the world. If you read the recent talk that he gave to the diplomatic corps that he gives at the beginning of each year, it's like this shopping list of catastrophic things that are happening around the world, and you want to say, good God, what's happening? This is terrible. But that's a reality. We look at the messiness in our own lives, and we recognize that's a reality. We look to the church for a response. It has a response. We trust in that response, and we actually take action. And I think the first thing to say is, what is our attitude to that messiness? How do we interpret that messiness? Does it hold us down? Does it keep us from being honest with ourselves? Are we afraid of it? How do you deal with it in others? How do we judge other people because of their messiness? And then how do we look at ourselves? I mentioned be honest. Pope Francis sort of embodies this. If you think about the way he carries himself, the things he talks about, one of the most famous sayings that that has ever been attributed to him, the famous, I am a sinner. I am a sinner who the Lord has looked upon. I can't tell you how many cardinals in the Vatican were having heart attacks when they heard Pope Francis say that, or when they read it in the magazine, in the Jesuit magazine in September of last year, 2 years ago. But there's an honesty, right? He's honest with himself. He knows that he is Father Bergoglio. He knows that he is, a human being just like us, and he's conscious of his littleness compared to the greatness of God and the greatness of Jesus, and that makes him all of a sudden so personable for us, and a model which we can look to help us be honest with ourselves.
I think authenticity is so key. Just knowing where we are and owning up to that and allowing God then to do the rest. I think that there's so much it's a temptation to try to be perfect, to say, when I'm ready, I'll be able to do this. But God doesn't ask that of us. He asks us to proclaim what God has already done for us in our lives. And I really think a wonderful example of that is that Samaritan woman when she meets him at the well, and he says, "Can I have a drink?" And she gives him the water, and she's just surprised that he knows all this stuff about her, and she's a woman of ill repute. And then what happens after that? She goes out, and it doesn't matter what she's done. What matters is that Christ has touched her life, and that something has changed. And so that's where we begin. We begin with that impetus, but it begins with an honesty where we are first.
I think the next thing is you can't be afraid to make mistakes. If you read kind of between the lines of what those quotes that I read you, what Pope Francis is saying, it's okay to make mistakes, and we should almost expect to make mistakes in our own lives, in the way that we deal with other people. No relationships are perfect, no lives are perfect, whatever. But if we come from this, trust and faith perspective that Cheridan mentioned, it can be very life-giving amidst all that. We mentioned the synod on the family last October, and a number of the bishops said, okay, we look at these pastoral situations that people find themselves in, and they're very complex. How can we encourage people? This was a question that came up in the synod hall. How can we encourage people who are not living the ideal to be evangelizers and to participate in the life of the church? How does the church community incorporate that reality of people? How do we react to that? How do we respond to that? Are we open? Are we welcoming? These are all very important questions, but don't be afraid to make mistakes. And the spontaneity of the Pope is the best example of that. So that when he's at a Lenten prayer service at the Vatican, and he pushes Monsignor Marini aside and goes to confession, on television, you're like, again, heart attacks at the Vatican. But he's not afraid. He's just himself. He said in a recent interview with an Argentinian newspaper that when he was elected, he said to himself, well, I've been me my whole life. There's no point in stopping now. I think I'm just going to continue doing what I'm doing. That would be silly if I tried to change who I was. And so we saw him come out on the balcony as Jorge Bergoglio, as Father Bergoglio. And that was so, it was different and unique, but it was him, and it was authentic. But we can't be afraid to make mistakes.
I think one of the big things that you can take away from Pope Francis is this attitude of listening. Listen to people, listen to others. Make that space within yourself to really take the other person in and see where they're coming from. And I think that that's so perfectly exemplified in everything that Pope Francis does. I mean, the fact that he moved to Casa Santa Marta, the fact that he has daily mass, that he knows what everyone is doing there. He talks with everyone. He knows their families. He is connected. He is present to everyone that he's surrounded with. So I think that that is such a beautiful example to all of us about how we should engage other people. I think we do so little of that in our own lives.
I have to tell you a quick story because it kind of just picks up on this. There's an American cardinal who we know well. I won't name him, but he's a great man. And he was in Rome for a meeting in November of 2013. And the Pope came to the meeting, and he said to him, Your Eminence, I'd like to see you at my house this afternoon at 5 o'clock. So, just come by whenever. And the Cardinal said, well, you've told us. He said, I've never been invited to a private audience like this with the Pope. I don't know. Okay, so he went to the North American College. He was there all afternoon. He got dressed up and went down around 4:30. And so he goes to Santa Marta, and they have a Swiss guard that stands out front, and then they have a lady behind the desk, who's the receptionist. And so he gets there, and the Swiss guard was there, and then the head of the Vatican police came out, who the Cardinal knows, and so he's, hello and everything. And he said, I understand that you're here to see the Pope. And the Cardinal said, yes. And he said, okay, well listen, Your Eminence, when you go up there, you have to tell him that he needs to move out of here, because it's impossible to protect him, because he's inviting all these people randomly to come and see him, and we can't do anything. We don't know who's coming and who's not coming, and who's legit and who's not legit, and all. So please, you have to tell him. And the Cardinal said, well, you're the head of security. That's your job to tell him, not mine. So anyway, the Cardinal went in, got in the elevator and took it up to the second floor. And the elevator opened, and the Pope was standing in the hallway there greeting him. And the Cardinal said, he's kind of surprised, and he put out his hand to greet the Pope. And the Pope said, did those fools downstairs tell you that I have to move out of here? He said, actually, Holy Father, yes, they did. And he said, pay no attention, they're telling everybody that. So there's a great kind of lightheartedness and spirit about him, and spontaneity, but he's very perceptive and very intelligent at the same time.
And I think the other thing that we can really take away from Pope Francis is this idea of be open to God's surprises. Don't have so much of your own mindset or your own plans, because God, if you allow Him to work in your life, He's going to surprise you. You're going to go in directions that you never thought that you were going to go. And I think that if you have trust in the Lord, and I think that that's something that Pope Francis so beautifully exemplifies, is the sense of God is mysterious, and God will surprise you, and be open to that.
Yeah, that's a great point, and just kind of building on that, the Synod on the Family. Very quickly, the Pope really said at the beginning of that, speak openly, speak honestly, and listen humbly. That was all that he asked. And then the bishops talked amongst themselves. There were some great arguments amongst some of them. And really, the synod, we can talk more about this later, but the synod is about the ideal of Catholic teaching about marriage and family, the pastoral reality that people find themselves in, and trying to bridge that gap. And how do we do that? And we have people in the church that think it's this way, and we have people in the church that think it's this way, and we have people in the church at every level in between. But the Pope, in his wisdom of calling this two-stage synod and allowing the conversation to happen at the grassroots level and everything, he honestly believes that if we have this open conversation and we have this attitude that Cheridan is talking about, the truth will reveal itself. You know, it's the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, that through the journey, and Jesus gets them to tell their own story, that they come to a realization of the truth, of the greater truth. And that's what he believes. But he believes that it's hugely important to allow yourself to be open to that. As soon as you think that you have everything figured out, or that everything has to be one way, or that every, teaching of the church with every T crossed and every I dotted has to be, enforced like rigidly. That's not the reality. The reality is something else, and the church has to bridge that reality.
He's always talking about how we need to be joyful. He's like, don't walk around with sour faces. If you really, the new evangelization begins with a keen sense of the resurrection of Christ. The world is the crucifixion, right? It's the end. It's sin, it's original sin, it's the structures of sin, and there seems to be a finality to that. But what we know is that the tomb is empty, and that the resurrection has occurred, and that we carry that truth, that realization for 2,000 years plus. So we should be joyful. We know that death does not have the final word. And so the new evangelization and effective evangelization begins with a keen sense of the resurrection, which means we're people of joy.
Yeah, an evangelizer can never look like someone who just came back from a funeral. That's what the Pope says. And just finally, I think get to know your faith. There's an intellectual or educational component to faith. There's an educational component to faith. It's not necessarily intellectual, that's a part of it. But the important thing is to understand what we actually believe. And if you look at what Pope Francis said, Pope Francis is striking for the same reason that Jesus was striking. That's what I believe. And when you read his exhortation, for example, he has this great section about the heart of the gospel. And he said, whatever the church teaches about morals and marriage and family life and this and that, nothing is more important than the heart of the gospel, which is the fact that we believe in a loving, compassionate, merciful God, and that God was revealed to us in the person of Jesus Christ, and Jesus reflects those characteristics and qualities, and therefore we must live like that too. If you can communicate that to people, the other things will kind of fall into place. So those were the qualities of Pope Francis that we think if we can somehow try to adopt, we will be effective evangelizers. But we were not going to let you off the hook that easily. We wanted to conclude by telling you a few things of what not to do. And we took essentially this list of things that we're going to go through very quickly from the Pope's address to the members of the Curia just before Christmas. He sort of gave them an examination of conscience, and he listed a number of temptations, or as he called them, sicknesses, that he felt were alive in the Vatican, working in the different Vatican offices and everything. These are all the Vatican officials, right? The people, so they're all cardinals, bishops, priests, and lay people as well, a few lay people, who work permanently in the bureaucratic structure of the Vatican. The first one, to avoid. The sickness of excessive busyness, namely of those who immerse themselves in work, neglecting, inevitably, the better part, which is to be seated at Jesus' feet. He's talking about the story of Mary and Martha. To neglect necessary rest leads to stress and agitation. Don't work too hard.
The next one is the sickness of excessive planning and functionalism. When the person plans everything minutely and thinks that with the perfect plannings, things effectively progress, thus becoming an accountant or a business person.
So an effective evangelizer is not just an accountant or a business person. The sickness of rivalry and vainglory. When appearance, the color of clothes, and signs of honor become the primary objective of life, forgetting St. Paul's words, quote, "Do nothing from selfishness or conceit, but in humility count others better than yourselves."
The sickness of existential schizophrenia. It is the sickness of those who live a double life. They create a parallel world for themselves where they put aside all that they severely teach others, and they begin to live a life hidden and often dissolute.
The sickness, this one especially applies to us. I mean, us collectively. Us human beings, yeah. The sickness of gossip, of grumbling, and of tittle-tattle. This is a grave sickness, the Pope says, that begins simply, perhaps just having 2 or 3 chats, and then it takes hold of the person, making them a sower of discord, and in many cases, a murderer in cold blood of the reputation of his or her colleagues and brothers and sisters. It is the sickness of guarded persons who, not having the courage to speak directly, speak behind other people's backs.
Yeah, and this is a very good one because I think that, Pope Francis talks about it all the time. I mean, I've read so many homilies and addresses that speak to this specific thing. The sickness of indifference to others, when one thinks only of oneself and loses the sincerity and warmth of human relations. When the most expert does not put their knowledge at the service of colleagues who are less expert. When one acquires knowledge of something and keeps it to themselves instead of sharing it positively with others. When, because of jealousy or cunning, one feels joy in seeing the other fall instead of lifting them up again and encouraging them.
The sickness of the mournful face. We talked about the importance of joy. People who believe that to be serious, they must depend on a melancholy and severe face and treat others, especially those regarded as inferior, with rigidity, harshness, and arrogance. These are often symptoms of fear and of one's own insecurity. A disciple must force him or herself to be a courteous, serene, enthusiastic, and joyful person who transmits joy wherever they are. We also need to have a sense of humor.
The sickness of accumulating. When the person seeks to fill an existential void in their heart by accumulating material goods, not out of necessity, but only to feel secure. In reality, we can take nothing material with us because the shroud does not have pockets. When was the last time you saw a hearse driving to a cemetery with a U-Haul behind it?
And finally, the sickness of closed circles. When belonging to a little group becomes more important than that of belonging to the bigger family, that is the church, and in some situations to Christ himself. Clickiness, to be avoided. And so that's the list. We didn't say them all, but that's a list that we thought were some that especially applied to all of us who are not working at the Vatican. But you can see that even just putting ourselves in solidarity with those who are receiving that message from the Pope just before Christmas, that we all share the same temptations and the same struggles in life, but that together we can do some incredible things. We can name things for what they are, and we can bring the message of the gospel to the world that's so badly needed today.